In this video, we're going to be doing something unique, something that bends the boundaries between this channel and our history channel, The Front. We're going to be looking at 5 clone units and how they compare to major real-world armies that fought in World War II. First things first, we have a few disclaimers. To start, we're going to be focusing on the major players in World War II, but we aren't at all saying that those nations were the only ones that fought. There were many others that simply didn't merit a comparison. Furthermore, these comparisons are generally superficial, based on 1 or 2 shared attributes that we've observed. Please remember that the word like is not the same as equal to. Just because we say that a clone unit shares some trait with the real world army does not mean that we're implying that they share any other traits with that army. Our second disclaimer ties into this as well. The Axis powers were evil, and we know this well. When we compare clone units to armies from the Axis nations, we are not implying that those clone units were evil in any way. Again, our comparisons are limited entirely to what we say in this video. With that out of the way, let's get right into things.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
First up, we have the 212th Attack Battalion as compared to the United States military. The 212th was a battalion under the command of General Obi-Wan Kenobi as part of the 7th Sky Corps, which specialized in rapid response missions. The 212th was often among the first units to make planetfall during a battle, and they made a habit of going right for enemy command centers, confident in their equipment and leadership. In particular, they were renowned for their clone paratroopers, and many men that fought in the unit incorporated jetpacks into their armor, most notably Commander Cody. They often worked directly with General Kenobi, and it could be argued that they became dependent on him. The US military, as it was in World War II, was a whole lot larger than a battalion, but the comparison still holds. The US was a bit of a late entry into the war, as we all know, but it nonetheless made its mark in the conflict, having led the charge in the Pacific Theater and having also been notably involved in North Africa and Western Europe. The US military was among the strongest forces that fought in the conflict, but it had one crucial weakness at the start. A lot of its enlisted soldiers were rather ill prepared for the war, with many being too old. To compensate, the US brought the full might of its industrial capabilities to bear, and even after the weaknesses in the common soldiery had been mostly amended, standard American tactics were nonetheless heavily reliant on superior equipment and armored vehicles. To a degree, the 212th and US are comparable in this manner, though the 212th was reliant less on equipment and more on General Kenobi. That said, both of these dependencies ended up working pretty well most of the time anyway, so it's rather forgivable. Furthermore, the two fighting forces share similar standard tactics, especially in regards to going right for the heart of enemy territory. It could also be said that both units notably used paratroopers, but the US wasn't by any means alone in this regard, and other countries used the tactic earlier and more frequently. Next up, we have the 91st Reconnaissance Corps, as compared to the military of the British Empire. The 91st was a small army in its own right and fought in several prolonged campaigns over the course of the Clone Wars. That said, however, entrenched warfare wasn't the most notable strength of the unit. That award goes to its scouts, who pioneered Common Republic reconnaissance tactics and of course gave the 91st its name. To contrast, the British Army was relatively small, especially at the start of World War II, which is part of the reason why they suffered greatly on most fronts during the early years of the conflict. But in comparison to the other allies, their military did have one claim to fame: their intelligence gathering. This was less the army and more the work of other arms of the military, but the army certainly profited from it, and it was perhaps the most notable contribution of the British to the Allied cause. The parallel here with the 91st Reconnaissance Corps should be pretty obvious. Our next comparison is probably the most obvious: the Galactic Marines as compared to the Red Army. The Galactic Marines are well known as the most brutal unit in the Grand Army of the Republic, but also one of the most effective. Under the leadership of Commander Bakara, the Marines emphasized victory at all costs, no matter the casualties, with one memorable story stating that when the prototype weapons used by the Galactic Marines on New Bornolix failed, they engaged a column of oncoming super battle droids in hand-to-hand combat and came out on top. The Red Army was the largest ground force involved in World War II, and if you take certain ridiculously conservative numbers as canon, they outnumbered the Grand Army of the Republic more than 5 times over. The Soviets took full advantage of their numerical superiority during their campaign on the Eastern Front to great effect, repeatedly beating the Wehrmacht with seas of infantry and sheer walls of tanks. Though their tactics were much more complex than the popular waves of meat shields myth would have many believe, they did ultimately take mass casualties that victories on the Eastern Front often caused in stride, putting victory first and foremost. Obviously, this is the same mentality commonly expressed by the Galactic Marines. Both the Red Army and the Galactic Marines operated on a brutal war doctrine that incurred large amounts of casualties but was also very successful, especially as both World War II and the Clone Wars dragged on respectively. As an added bonus, both units are also similar in they were actually prepared for harsh weather, with standard Galactic Marine armor being based on cold weather armor, and with the soldiers of the Red Army being trained and equipped for harsh Russian winters. Next up, we have the 501st Legion as compared to the Wehrmacht. The 501st Legion was a unit of elite clone troopers specially commissioned by Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, which for most of the war was commanded by Anakin Skywalker. Clones in the 501st were noted for their skill and ingenuity, the latter of which was encouraged by General Skywalker and frowned upon in many other clone units. Their standard tactics were quite heavily influenced by their commanding officer. The 501st was very aggressive in combat, with overwhelming force being the name of the game. The Wehrmacht was rather similar. Germany, after all, had been preparing for World War II for years, and it showed in the quality of their soldiers combat-wise. Soldiers fighting for Germany were usually rather well trained up until the end of the war, when military leaders became desperate, and ingenuity in combat was frequently encouraged. Furthermore, their tactics were some of the most aggressive in comparison to other armies that fought in the conflict, with the Wehrmacht's Blitzkrieg strategy being one of its most effective and most infamous go-to battle plans. Here too, the similarity should be rather evident. Both the 501st and the Wehrmacht were highly skilled and exceptionally aggressive. This one, it should be noted, is the only one on this list that has a basis in actual canon, though the stormtroopers of the 501st were based on the SS as opposed to the Wehrmacht itself. That said, the similarities are present, and while during the Clone Wars the 501st wasn't fighting for a brutal fascist regime yet, it wouldn't take long for this comparison to become even more accurate. Lastly, we have the 327th Star Corps as compared to the Japanese Imperial Army. The 327th was one of the Grand Army of the Republic's most ill-treated units, as their skill in combat in unusual environments got them some truly nasty assignments, most notably Fallujah at the end of the war. Thanks to Aayla Secura, their Jedi General, the 327th mostly made it through many of these, but not without plenty of pain. It didn't help that the unit was frequently undersupplied as well, with New Holstis and once more Fallujah being prime examples. The Imperial Japanese was a similar case. Many of their battlefronts were similarly bloodbaths, though this was due less to the environment and more so tactics. The Japanese were notable for their victory or death attitude, which the 327th didn't exactly share, although their relatives on Mandalore most definitely would have approved. The Japanese were also frequently undersupplied, especially garrisons on some of the more remote Pacific islands, which was one of their most notable weaknesses during the war. Similar casualty rates and similar supply issues define this parallel, though there are some differences in the details. Both were also pretty effective fighting forces, all things considered, despite their shared shortcomings. So those were our comparisons between 5 clone units and 5 major players in World War II. But as per usual guys, I want to know what you think. Would you switch any of these around, and can you think of any other good comparisons that we could do for a part 2 maybe? Let me know in the comments section below. And just before you go guys, if you are interested in history, make sure you check out our second channel called The Front. That link is at the top of the description if you want to check out a bunch of cool World War I, World War II, Vietnam War videos, and I'm pretty much deviating into everything history. So if that's right up your alley, make sure you check that out. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.